A wealthy woman in red heels thought she could stomp on the dignity of a pregnant street hawker without any consequences. She didn't realize that the powerful man she was supposed to marry was watching the entire scene from the shadows. What he saw in that moment would not only end their engagement but launch a series of events that would shock the city. Welcome to a story of cruelty, justice, and an unexpected rise to power. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The sun was not just shining that afternoon, it was attacking. The heat was so fierce that the air itself seemed to burn the skin, turning the busy Lagos bridal street into a shimmering oven. Every car bonnet along the road felt hot enough to fry an egg, radiating a dry metallic warmth that choked the breath out of passers-by. People hurried along the narrow walkways, their faces glistening with sweat, constantly dodging the reckless Okada riders and impatient drivers who honked their horns like angry goats. Amidst this chaos, Aide walked with a slow, agonizing rhythm, her body a map of exhaustion and quiet resilience. She was 25 years old, but today, her eyes looked decades older, shadowed by a fatigue that sleep could no longer cure. On her head, she balanced a blue plastic bowl, its weight pressing down on her neck. Inside, the last few sachets of pure water floated in a pool of lukewarm melted ice, a meager inventory that represented her only hope for the night. Her condition was impossible to ignore. Her pregnancy was at its peak, her belly a heavy, protruding sphere that made every movement a calculated risk. Her ankles were puffed to twice their normal size, her lower back throbbed with a rhythmic, dull ache, and her worn slippers offered no protection against the scorching pavement that seemed to bite at her swollen feet. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to sit down, to find a patch of shade and simply close her eyes, but Aide knew that rest was a luxury she could not afford. In her world, rest meant no money, and no money meant a hungry night and an empty stomach. Her rent was due in just a few days, and the small pile of baby clothes she had managed to gather was still heartbreakingly thin. Delivery could happen at any moment. The midwife, Amaka, had been stern during their last meeting, warning her that her body needed strength and that she must stop this grueling labor. Aide had nodded politely to Amaka, but the reality of her life was far more demanding than medical advice. Strength was not something she could find in rest. It was something she had to forge out of necessity to pay for diapers and a roof over her head. She adjusted the heavy bowl slightly, the cold water splashing against the plastic as she rubbed her belly gently with one free hand. It was a soft, maternal gesture in the middle of a harsh environment. "Please, it's not yet time to come," she murmured under her breath, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of the traffic. "Don't come yet. Mommy needs to walk a little more. Please behave today. Be nice to Mommy." She spoke to the life inside her as if it were her only friend, a silent partner in her struggle to survive. As if in reply, the baby kicked softly against her ribs, a sharp reminder that time was running out. She turned into the bridal material street, a place where the contrast between her life and the lives of others was most visible. On both sides of the road, shops displayed extravagant white wedding gowns, sparkling lace fabrics, and colorful head ties that glittered like jewels. She liked selling here because the customers were usually brides-to-be and their relatives, people who were often too distracted by the stress of bargaining and the oppressive heat to notice the price of a cold drink. They would buy in bulk, and on a good day, her bowl would be empty faster than anywhere else in the market. But today, the heat was making everything harder. The sun poured down without mercy, and the weight inside her belly felt even heavier than the bowl on her head. Sweat trickled down the small of her back, soaking her thin blouse. Her throat was a desert, parched and dry, yet she resisted the urge to drink one of her own sachets. She told herself she would only allow herself that single drink after she had sold half the bowl. Every sachet consumed was a loss she couldn't account for. Suddenly, the world seemed to tilt. A sharp stabbing pain shot through her lower back, wrapping around her waist like a hot, tightening iron. Aide gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she bent forward instinctively. The air felt too thin to breathe. She froze in the middle of the walkway, the bowl of water wobbling dangerously on her head as she tried to ride out the wave of agony. One hand went to her belly, feeling the baby shift and press down with terrifying force. "Oh, please, not now," she whispered, her eyes squeezed shut as she prayed for the contraction to pass. "Please, just give me a little more time." The pain eased after a few long, agonizing seconds, leaving her gasping and trembling. She straightened slowly, breathing through her mouth just as Amaka had taught her, trying to convince herself that she was fine. She had felt small cramps before, and they had always passed, allowing her to finish her work. This one had only caught her off guard because it was stronger, deeper, more final. With a shaky breath, she forced her leaden feet to move again. She was halfway down the street when the sensation returned, this time with a ferocity that made her knees nearly buckle. It wasn't just a cramp anymore. It felt like something was tearing from the inside, a primal force demanding to be released. Her vision blurred at the edges, the bright colors of the bridal shops bleeding into a messy smear of white and gold. Desperate for something to keep her from collapsing onto the hot dirt, she looked around. Her eyes landed on a shiny black luxury car parked just beside the walkway, its paint glowing like a dark mirror in the sun. She stepped close, her hand reaching out for the only stable thing in her crumbling world, and placed it gently on the top of the car door for support. She didn't care about the car or the person who owned it. She was just a woman trying to keep her child from the dust. Aide stood frozen, her fingers gripping the sleek, cool metal of the luxury car door as the world around her dissolved into a haze of white heat and red-hot agony. The contraction was a living thing, a predator clawing at her spine and wrapping its teeth around her waist with a ferocity that made her teeth rattle. She leaned her forehead against the tinted glass, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that fogged the window. In that moment, she wasn't a hawker, and she wasn't a trespasser. She was a mother trying to anchor herself against a tide that threatened to pull her under. The blue plastic bowl on her head tilted precariously, a few droplets of lukewarm water splashing onto the pristine black paint, but Aide was too far gone in her pain to notice the sacrilege she was committing against the machine. The sharp, rhythmic click-clack of high heels against the pavement cut through the roar of the Lagos traffic like a serrated blade. Rosemary approached the vehicle, her silhouette tall and imposing, draped in an expensive fitted yellow gown that seemed to mock the dusty surroundings. Her makeup was a flawless mask of perfection, untouched by the humidity that had turned Aide's face into a map of salt and grime. In her hand, she clutched a designer bag with a grip that spoke of ownership and entitlement. As she drew closer, her eyes narrowed, landing first on the dirty, swollen hand touching her car door, and then on the woman attached to it. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You filthy rat! How dare you touch my baby?" Rosemary's voice sliced through the air, drawing the immediate attention of the nearby traders and shoppers. Aide jerked in surprise, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to pull herself upright, but the pain in her belly pinned her down. She looked up with blurred vision, her voice a trembling thread of sound. "Sorry, Ma. Please. I suddenly had pain. I had to hold it for support." Rosemary stepped closer, the smell of her expensive perfume clashing violently with the scent of sweat and melted ice. "Are you blind?" she snapped, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "You did not see my car? Is my baby too small for you to see?" Aide blinked, her confusion momentarily overriding her agony. She realized with a sinking heart that Rosemary was referring to the car, the cold, unfeeling hunk of metal, as if it were a living child, even as a real human life struggled to hold onto its dignity just inches away. The crowd began to gather, a circle of hushed whispers and worried glances. Mama Susan from the fabric shop stepped forward, her hands raised in a plea for peace. "Please, customer, forgive her," she urged, her voice soft but firm. "She is just a poor woman looking for how to survive." Alhaji Sani added his voice from across the road, pointing out that Aide was clearly in distress, but Rosemary didn't even turn her head. Rosemary's fury had moved beyond words. "You have to clean my car," she demanded, her finger pointing at the faint smudge of sweat on the door. "Your water. Use it to wash where you touched. Wash your stench off my car. Wash it now." Aide shook her head feebly, her hands clutching her belly as another wave of labor rolled over her. "Madam, please, if I use the water to wash, I will run at a loss. As you can see, I am very pregnant. Please forgive me." The mention of the pregnancy seemed to act as a fuel rather than a deterrent. Rosemary's eyes narrowed into slits. Without a word of warning, her hand shot out. The slap was loud and sharp, a crack of thunder that echoed in the small space between them. The force of the blow sent Aide stumbling sideways. Her worn slippers lost their grip on the dusty pavement, and she crashed down onto the burning ground with a choked gasp. The impact was devastating. Pain exploded in her lower back and shot through her abdomen like a lightning strike. As she lay there in the dirt, her eyes widened in a sudden icy horror. She felt a warm, heavy gush of fluid between her legs, soaking through her clothes and pooling on the hot cement. "Madam, please," she begged, her voice now a broken sob. My water just broke." Rosemary looked down at her, showing no more empathy than she would for a squashed insect. Instead of horror, her face only deepened in loathing. She reached down, grabbed Aide's arm with a bruising grip, and began to drag her across the rough ground toward the rear of the car. "I said wash my car now, you filthy gopher rat," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She gave Aide one final violent shove that sent her sprawling back into the dust before stepping back and fastidiously straightening her dress. "Next time, know your place," she spat. Without a backward glance at the woman writhing in labor on the floor, Rosemary marched to the driver's side, the engine of her car roaring to life a moment later as she sped away, leaving a cloud of exhaust and dust to settle over the shattered woman she had left behind. Aide sat on the pavement, clutching her belly as the street noise began to swallow her cries, unaware that from the other side of the road, Kelechi was standing in a frozen, horrified silence. The heavy silence that followed the roar of Rosemary's engine was more suffocating than the Lagos heat. Across the street, standing in the shadow of a wide concrete pillar, Kelechi felt as though the world had suddenly slowed to a nauseating crawl. He was a man of stature, tall and neatly dressed in a light blue shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, but in this moment, he felt paralyzed by a profound sense of horror. He had arrived early for a business meeting with one of the major shop owners in the bridal district, but the meeting was now the furthest thing from his mind. His eyes remained fixed on the spot where the black luxury car had just been, the spot where a human being now lay broken in the dust. For the past year, Kelechi had believed he was in love with a woman who was gentle, sweet, and kind. He had described Rosemary to his friends as a jewel, a woman of grace who matched his own ambition with a soft heart. They were supposed to be married in a few short weeks. The invitations were already in the hands of the city's elite, and the preparations were almost complete. But the woman he had just seen was not the woman he had asked to be his wife. The image of Rosemary's face, twisted in a mask of primal disgust as she screamed the words "filthy gopher rat," burned behind his eyelids like a brand. He could still hear the sharp, sickening crack of her hand hitting Aide's face, a sound that seemed to echo louder than the surrounding market noise. It was as if a thick, shimmering veil had been torn away from his eyes, revealing a monster where he thought a queen had stood. He watched the crowd, the traders like Mama Susan and Alhaji Sani, who stood by with pitying eyes but seemed too intimidated by the display of wealth to do more than whisper. The injustice of it turned Kelechi's blood into ice. He saw Aide sitting on the pavement, her hands clutching her pregnant belly, her eyes wet with a mixture of physical agony and the raw sting of humiliation. She looked so small against the backdrop of the towering bridal shops, a discarded soul in a street dedicated to the celebration of new beginnings. Without a conscious thought, Kelechi stepped out of the shadows. His jaw was clenched so tightly it ached, and his heart pounded against his ribs with a rhythm of pure, unadulterated fury. He crossed the road with long, purposeful strides, his shadow falling over Aide before she even realized someone was standing there. She looked up at him, her face pale and streaked with salt and dirt, her expression a haunting blend of confusion and terror. She expected another blow, another insult, another person to tell her she was nothing. "Madam," Kelechi said, his voice urgent and thick with a compassion that seemed to startle her. He didn't see a filthy rat or a nuisance. He saw a mother in crisis. He crouched beside her in the dirt, ignoring the dust that clung to his expensive trousers. He looked over his shoulder and signaled to his driver, Okeke, who had been waiting by their own vehicle with a look of stunned disbelief. "Okeke, help me lift her," Kelechi ordered. Together, the two men supported Aide as she struggled to her feet. She winced, a sharp groan escaping her lips as her water-soaked clothes clung to her legs, but she didn't resist them. She was too exhausted to fight, her body entirely surrendered to the labor that Rosemary had violently accelerated. They guided her toward Kelechi's car, a vehicle far more luxurious than the one she had dared to touch, yet this time the door was opened wide for her with reverence. As the cold air from the car's air conditioning hit her face, Aide let out a shaky breath. Kelechi settled into the back seat beside her, while Okeke took the wheel, his face set in a grim mask of determination. "Hospital now," Kelechi commanded, his voice leaving no room for delay. As the car pulled away from the bridle street, leaving the whispering crowd behind, Kelechi looked at the woman beside him. She was panting now, her eyes shut tight as she held her belly with both hands. "Don't worry," he said softly, reaching out to steady her as Okeke swerved through the thick traffic. "You'll be all right. I'll make sure of it." Aide blinked at him, still trying to understand why this powerful stranger was treating her like a human being. She had no idea who he was, nor did she know that he was the man who was supposed to marry her attacker. Inside the quiet, cool sanctuary of the car, Kelechi felt a coldness of a different kind spreading through his chest. He thought of the ring he had placed on Rosemary's finger and the life they had planned. In that single afternoon, the heat of Lagos had stripped away all the lies. He knew then that the wedding would never happen. He was a man of honor, and he could not bind his soul to someone who could look at a suffering mother and see only a stain on a car door. The woman in the red heels had lost everything that day, she just didn't know it yet. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it really was as Okeke swerved through the thick Lagos traffic, his hand heavy on the horn. Inside the car, the silence was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and Aide's rapid, shallow breathing. She had her eyes shut tight, one hand clutching her belly while the other gripped the seat so hard her knuckles turned white. Every few seconds, she let out a soft, broken groan that seemed to twist a knife in Kelechi's heart. "Just hold on," Kelechi said quietly, his own chest feeling tight with an anxiety he couldn't quite explain for a woman he had only just met. "We are almost there." The car pulled into the hospital compound, the sound of shouting traders and the chaotic symphony of the city fading behind them. Two nurses, recognizing the urgency of the situation, rushed out with a wheelchair before the car had even come to a full stop. "She's in labor," Kelechi told them, his voice sharp with command. "Please, she is in immense pain. Hurry." They helped Aide out of the vehicle, her body trembling as they settled her into the wheelchair and wheeled her through the bright, cold corridors of the facility. Kelechi walked beside her, his eyes scanning the environment. The air smelled of antiseptic and something metallic, a stark contrast to the dusty, sun-baked street they had left behind. Inside the delivery ward, they were met by Dr. Chick, a man in his late 30s who wore green scrubs and an expression of calm professionalism. He glanced at Aide, then turned his gaze to Kelechi. "Are you her husband?" the doctor asked. Kelechi didn't hesitate, though the truth was complicated. "No," he replied, "I found her in distress. She needs help immediately." Dr. Chick nodded and began a rapid examination of Aide, his face growing increasingly serious as he took in her condition. "She's malnourished and extremely exhausted," he noted, looking back at Kelechi with a grim intensity. "The baby's heartbeat is weak. She is too tired to push, and the trauma of her fall has complicated things." The doctor's next words hit like a physical blow. "We need to do an emergency surgery right now, or we could lose both mother and child." Aide's eyes widened in horror, her hand instinctively reaching for Kelechi's arm. "Surgery," she whispered, the fear in her voice palpable. Dr. Chick leaned down, his voice softening but remaining firm. "It's the safest option now, Aide. Do you have any family we can call for consent?" Aide shook her head slowly, tears spilling over her cheeks. "No, no family. Dr. Chick turned to Kelechi, the unspoken question of payment and responsibility hanging in the air. Kelechi stepped closer to Ade's side, looking directly into her eyes. "Do you understand what the doctor is saying?" he asked. Ade looked up at him, her face pale but suddenly determined. "If it will save my baby, do it," she said. With trembling hands, she signed the consent form, and the nurses moved with practiced speed, wheeling her away toward the swinging double doors of the operating theater. The moment the doors closed, Kelechi was left standing in the sudden silence of the corridor. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat, a dull thudding that mirrored the ticking of the wall clock. He dropped into one of the hard plastic chairs against the wall, his mind racing. He didn't know why he felt so invested. She was a stranger whose name he had only just learned. But the image of her lying on the hot pavement, being dragged like a gopher rat by the woman he was supposed to marry, wouldn't leave him. Every time he replayed the scene, his stomach twisted with a fresh wave of disgust for Rosemary. Minutes turned into an hour. Kelechi ignored his buzzing phone, the meeting he was supposed to attend completely forgotten. Finally, the theater doors swung open, and Dr. Chick walked out, pulling off his surgical gloves. Kelechi stood immediately, his voice catching. "Doctor, how is she?" Dr. Chick's face softened into a tired but genuine smile. "Congratulations. The woman you brought has delivered a bouncing baby boy." Kelechi hadn't realized he had been holding his breath until that very second. He exhaled deeply, a massive wave of relief washing over him. "Thank God," he murmured, leaning back against the wall. Dr. Chick continued, "She is very weak and will need rest, proper food, and intensive care to recover. The baby is a little underweight, but he is a fighter." Kelechi nodded vigorously, pulling out his wallet. "Please, whatever she needs, food, medicine, the best room, give it to her. I will handle everything." He walked to the nurse's station and paid the bills in full, leaving an extra deposit to ensure Ade and the child he would soon know as Kelechi Jr. would want for nothing. The sun was setting outside, but inside the hospital, a new light had been lit, and Kelechi knew his life would never be the same. Morning light streamed into Kelechi's bedroom, but he had barely slept a wink. His mind was a frantic loop of hospital corridors, the metallic smell of antiseptic, and the haunting look of gratitude in Ade's eyes. He felt a deep magnetic pull to return to the hospital, an urge to ensure the woman he had rescued was truly safe. By mid-morning, he was walking through the familiar cold halls once more, the nurses nodding respectfully as he passed toward the private ward he had secured for her. When he pushed the door open, he found Ade sitting up, her back against a mountain of pillows, cradling the tiny bundle in her arms. Her face broke into a smile so warm it seemed to chase away the sterile gloom of the room. "Thank you very much, sir," she said, her voice steady and gentle. She looked down at the sleeping infant and then back at Kelechi with a soft, profound determination. "I am going to name him Kelechi Jr. after this good Samaritan that saved us. Your name is going to be Kelechi from today," she whispered to the baby. Kelechi stood there, a strange tight knot forming in his chest. "I am honored you named your son after me," he managed to say, his voice low and thick with emotion. From that moment, he made it his silent mission to ensure they would never suffer again. He became a constant presence in their lives, a guardian appearing with fresh fruits, baby formula, and small treats for Ade. When the day of her discharge arrived, he insisted on accompanying her to the apartment she had previously rented. The sight of the building made his jaw tighten. It was an old, crumbling structure with cracked walls and windows stiff with rust. Inside, the small room held nothing but a bed, a wooden chair, and a tin trunk. "You can't possibly stay here with a newborn," Kelechi said, his eyes scanning the bleak surroundings. Ade adjusted the baby in her arms, her pride still flickering. "We will manage, sir. You have done enough already." But Kelechi shook his head firmly. She deserved more than managing. Before she could protest further, he was on his phone, leveraging his connections. Within hours, he had secured a clean, modern apartment in a quiet, safe neighborhood. He paid 2 years of rent up front and furnished the space with everything a new mother could need. "This is too much," Aide whispered, her eyes wet with tears as she looked at her new home. "Just rest," Kelechi told her firmly, remembering the doctor's orders. Every Thursday, without fail, he arrived with supplies, diapers, cooking oil, and clothes, spending hours playing with Kelechi Jr. and chatting with Aide. He felt a peace in that small apartment that he could no longer find in his own mansion. However, while Aide's life was stabilizing, Kelechi's home life was transforming into a silent war zone. Rosemary noticed the change instantly. The man who was supposed to be her doting fiancé had become quiet, distracted, and prone to avoiding her gaze. At first, she dismissed it as work-related stress, but as the weeks passed, a toxic suspicion began to gnaw at her heart. She started watching him with the intensity of a predator. While he showered, she would pounce on his phone, scrolling through his bank apps for suspicious transfers and hunting through his messages for a secret lover's name. To her mounting frustration, she found nothing but professional correspondence and mundane details. The lack of evidence only fueled her obsession. She began to wonder if he was hiding his tracks with professional precision. One morning, after he left for the office, Rosemary decided to take matters into her own hands. She trailed his car at a safe distance, parking across from his office building and watching the entrance like a hawk for hours. Day after day, she saw nothing unusual, yet her gut told her that the man she owned was slipping through her fingers. Then, on a fateful Thursday afternoon, she saw him leave the office earlier than usual. She followed him to a large supermarket, her heart pounding against her ribs. Peering through the glass doors, she watched him move through the aisles, filling a cart with items that made her blood run cold: baby diapers, tins of formula, tiny clothes, and a soft stuffed bear. Rosemary pulled out her phone, recording the scene with trembling hands. "So he does have another family," she hissed to herself, her grip tightening on the device. She watched him load the bags into his car and drive across town to a modest but respectable apartment building. She waited until he emerged 10 minutes later, empty-handed and driving away, before she stepped out of her car. Her jaw was clenched with a murderous intent as she marched toward the door he had just exited, ready to destroy whatever world Kelechi had built in the shadows. The afternoon heat sat over the neighborhood like a heavy curse, and the dust on the street clung to the air, sticking to skin and clothes as if trying to reclaim everything for the earth. Inside the quiet safety of her new apartment, Aide had just finished washing Kelechi Jr.'s tiny shirts, spreading them carefully on the rope outside while the baby slept soundly. She felt a sense of peace she had never known, unaware that the shadow of her past was currently pulling up to the curb. The loud, violent screech of car brakes braking sharply in front of the compound shattered the silence, and Aide froze, a cold shiver running down her spine despite the sweltering temperature. Rosemary stepped out of her vehicle, looking like a queen of malice in a fitted yellow gown, her sunglasses pushed high on her head like a crown she did not deserve. She was not alone. Behind her stood 4 men, heavy-set and grim-faced, the kind of men whose muscles were not built in a gym but through years of carrying trouble and lifting heavy burdens. One of the neighbors whispered a warning to Aide from a nearby corner, sensing that a storm had arrived, but there was no time to hide. The men did not offer a greeting. They brushed past Aide with a terrifying indifference, kicked open her door, and began dragging her belongings out into the dirt. Aide watched in horror as her new life was dismantled in seconds. The baby's cot, a small mattress, and a bag of diapers were tossed onto the cement. A pot rolled out and clanged against the ground, and then, the sound that broke her heart, Kelechi Jr.'s feeding bottle hit the pavement and cracked into pieces. Aide ran forward, her chest tight with panic, pleading for them to stop. "Please, please be careful. There is a baby inside," she cried out, but her voice was drowned out by Rosemary's cold, whipping tone. "This house was rented by my fiancé," Rosemary announced to the gathering crowd, her eyes flashing with a predatory triumph. "I no longer want to see you here." The neighbors who had gathered gasped at the cruelty of the scene, one old woman muttering about the lack of shame on Rosemary's face. Aide's lips trembled, and she felt the weight of a double humiliation. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had never even known who Kelechi was to this woman, but the words stuck in her parched throat. Before she could speak, Rosemary clapped her hands together loudly, mocking Ade's very existence. "Help your generation, you miserable lowlife," Rosemary spat. "First you touch my car, and now you try to snatch my fiancé." The sound of Kelechi Jr. crying from inside the house drew Rosemary's attention like a scent of blood. She pushed past Ade, her head snapping toward the sound of the infant. "Who is the father of this child? Is it my fiancé?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shriek. Ade shook her head frantically, trying to shield the doorway, but Rosemary's hand shot out in a repeat of their first encounter. The force of the slap made Ade stumble backward, and Rosemary seized her arm, dragging her forward with a strength born of pure obsession. "I will destroy you and your son," Rosemary hissed, her face inches from Ade's. "I will make sure you disappear from the face of this earth." Ade clutched her crying baby to her chest, shielding him with her own body as Rosemary continued to yank at her arm. Neighbors finally began to rush in, led by Mama Tund from next door and a young man from the block. "Madam, please, this is not right," Mama Tund shouted, stepping between the two women to break Rosemary's grip. Rosemary snapped at them, claiming Ade was ruining her life, but the neighbors stood their ground, eventually pushing the enraged woman back toward the door. As Rosemary was forced outside, she stumbled into the sunlight, still shouting threats that she would be back to finish what she started. When the door was finally closed and the neighbors helped Ade into a chair, she sat in the wreckage of her home, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to soothe her screaming child. It was then that a neighbor, speaking in a low, pitying whisper, revealed the truth that hit Ade harder than any eviction. The man who had been her savior, the man who had given her a name for her son, was indeed Rosemary's fiancé. The revelation made the world feel small and dangerous, turning her sanctuary into a battlefield. Ade looked at her scattered belongings in the dirt, realizing that her good Samaritan had a life she could never be part of, and the heat of Lagos seemed to settle over her once more like a heavy, suffocating shroud. The following Thursday afternoon, Kelechi arrived at the apartment building with a trunk full of supplies and a heart lightened by the prospect of seeing Kelechi Jr.'s toothless grin. He expected the usual quiet rhythm of the neighborhood, but as he parked his car, he was met with a wall of silence that felt heavy and wrong. He knocked on Ade's door, but there was no answer, only the hollow echo of his own knuckles against the wood. A neighbor, Mama Tund, poked her head out from a nearby room, her face a mask of pity that made Kelechi's blood run cold. "Oga, she no day here," she whispered, her voice trembling as she recounted the horror of the previous days. She spoke of a woman who called herself his wife, a woman who had arrived with hired thugs to beat Ade, terrorize the baby, and throw their meager belongings into the dirt under the accusation of witchcraft and seduction. Kelechi felt a cold, solid weight settle in his chest as the neighbor referred to the attacker as his wife. "She is not my wife," he corrected, his voice low and dangerous, but the neighbor only shrugged. In her eyes, the damage was already done and the victims were gone. That evening, Kelechi did not just walk into his mansion, he stormed in like a gathering storm. He found Rosemary on the sofa, bathed in the warm glow of the lavish living room, scrolling through her phone with a face painted in perfect, unbothered makeup. To her, the world was fine, but to Kelechi, the sight of her was suddenly repulsive. He stood before her, his jaw so tightly clenched that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. "A few months ago, I saw what you did to a pregnant woman on the street," he began, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the room. "You slapped her, insulted her, and watched her water break before you abandoned her in the dust. I was the one who took her to the hospital. And today, I learned you drove her and her innocent son into the street." Rosemary froze, her phone slipping from her manicured fingers and thudding onto the rug as her eyes widened in a sudden, frantic realization. The mask of the gentle fiancé shattered instantly. Kelechi continued, his words falling like hammer blows. "That woman you call a gutter rat is 10 times better than you will ever be. I cannot marry a woman like you. This relationship is over." He didn't just end the engagement, he dismantled her entire world in a single breath. "Pack your things and leave my house," he commanded, his voice final and cutting. Rosemary scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she tried to reach for him, her voice rising in a desperate, shrill plea. "Please, baby, forgive me. I thought you were having an affair. You can't do this. The invitations are out. People will laugh at me." But Kelechi only felt a deep sense of disgust where his love used to be. He stepped back as if her very touch would contaminate him. "I don't care," he replied, turning away from her tears. He called for his gateman, Okeke, and gave the order that would seal her fate. "Throw her things out. Bar her entry. She is never to set foot on this property again." He watched from the window, unmoved, as Rosemary was escorted to the gates, her designer bags tossed onto the pavement just as she had tossed Ade's baby clothes days before. The irony was as sharp as the heels she wore, but Kelechi had no time for satisfaction. As soon as the gates clicked shut, he picked up his phone and called a private investigator. "Find Ade and her son now," he ordered, his voice thick with a new kind of resolve. He spent the rest of the night pacing the hollow mansion, the silence no longer a comfort but a reminder of the woman he had failed to protect. He knew he had won a battle for his own soul by casting Rosemary out, but the real victory would only come when he found the woman sitting under a tree somewhere, holding a child named after him, and convinced her that she was finally safe. The following weeks were a whirlwind of quiet restoration and brewing storms. Kelechi had found Ade and her son at a modest church, where she had been staying with a kind member after Rosemary's eviction drove her into hiding. Though he had convinced her to come back under his protection by offering her a position as a maid to save her pride, the truth was evident to everyone in the mansion. She was the heart of the home. However, news of Kelechi's broken engagement and his growing bond with a market woman traveled through the family grapevine like a brushfire. When he finally announced his intention to marry Ade, the Cletus household erupted into a theater of war. The meeting was not a casual dinner. It was a political tribunal summoned with military precision at the family's ancestral home. Kelechi walked into the living room to find the council of elders already seated, their faces set in grim masks of tradition. His mother, Mrs. Cletus, sat like a kettle on the verge of whistling, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Beside her, Mr. Cletus kept his own counsel, though his eyes were heavy with the weight of the family's reputation. The room was anchored by the presence of Uncle Joshua and Uncle James, along with the sharp-tongued Auntie Julie and the observant Auntie Rita. Uncle James was the first to break the silence, leaning back in his chair and shaking his head with a sigh that carried the weight of generations. "Kelechi, my son, you must listen to your mother," he began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "This woman is not on our level. There are fresh young girls without baggage out there for a man of your status. Why choose a widow, a single mother who sold water on the streets?" The room murmured in agreement, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old prejudices. Kelechi stayed calm, but his words were like surgical strikes, designed to peel back the hypocrisy of the people sitting before him. He turned his gaze directly toward Uncle James. "Uncle, when you were marrying Auntie Julie, did you have anything to your name? You told me yourself that she was richer and older than you, yet you married her and built a life that has lasted decades." Uncle James coughed into his hand, suddenly finding the pattern on the floor very interesting as he avoided his nephew's eyes. The silence that followed was so heavy you could have heard a mosquito cough. Kelechi did not stop there. He turned to Auntie Rita, whose own history was a secret kept in plain sight. "Auntie Rita, you told me when I was a boy that you were a single mother before you met Uncle Joshua. He didn't see you as baggage, he saw a woman he loved. You have been happy for 30 years. Why is my choice any different?" Auntie Julie tried to intervene, waving a hand dismissively as if to brush away the logic. "Well, that's different. Times were different then," she argued, but the conviction in her voice was wavering. Kelechi stood his ground, his voice low but final. "It is not different. I saw a woman being treated like a dog by the person I was supposed to marry, and I saw a strength in her that Rosemary will never possess. I am not asking for permission, I am telling you who my wife will be." As the hours passed, The tide began to turn. One of the older uncles, moved by Kelechi's unwavering resolve, turned to Mr. and Mrs. Cletus. "Brother, let him marry his choice," he advised, his tone softening. "This generation, if you force them, they will only do the unthinkable. The woman is young and fertile. She will give you many grandchildren. It is better to bless them now before the matter makes headlines and brings real shame to our name." Mrs. Cletus looked as though she had bitten into a sour lemon, her eyes flashing with a lingering resentment, but she remained silent. She wasn't ready to smile yet, and she promised herself she would never pretend to be happy about this union. However, Mr. Cletus finally leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. He knew that to keep fighting would be to lose his son completely. "Fine," he said, his voice carrying the finality of the tribunal's end. "We will allow it." The first battle was won, but as Kelechi walked out of the room, he knew the war for Aid's acceptance into the heart of the family was only just beginning. The wedding was a simple but beautiful affair, devoid of extravagant fireworks or celebrity musicians, focusing instead on heartfelt vows and a family that had finally decided to behave. When Aid moved into the mansion as Mrs. Kelechi Cletus, the transition was not without its silent challenges. Mrs. Cletus moved through the house like a kettle left too long on the stove, her presence a constant whistle of disapproval that made the air feel thin and cold. She managed only stiff, nasal greetings, refusing to glance at Aid for more than a second or touch the baby. Yet, Aid met this frost with a polite smile and respectful words, refusing to let the coldness of the mansion extinguish the fire Kelechi had helped her rekindle. It wasn't long before Kelechi set a transformative plan in motion to ensure his wife would never be viewed as a liability again. He opened a bakery in her name, providing delivery vans and introducing her to his network of top-tier suppliers. Aid threw herself into the business with the same grit she once used to survive the Lagos sun, but now she had the resources to match her ambition. Her bread began to appear in major supermarkets, church bazaars, and school canteens across the state. She was no longer just a woman who baked. She was a strategist who hired staff and built a sprawling connection of distributors. Soon, multiple branches popped up, and the household staff began to whisper about Madame Aid, the bread queen. As her business empire expanded, the dynamics within the mansion began to shift under the weight of her success and quiet dignity. However, the final wall of resistance didn't crumble until 1 year into the marriage when Aid went into labor for the second time. When the news reached the Cletus household that she had given birth to twin boys, the tension that had gripped the home for over a year finally snapped. Kelechi paced the hospital corridors like an expectant father for the second time in his life, his excitement nearly bursting from his chest. At the hospital, the transformation of Mrs. Cletus was instant and staggering. The moment she laid eyes on the twins, their tiny fists waving and lips puckered in newborn protest, her eyes shone with a light that hadn't been seen since the wedding. "Well done, my wife," she said, her voice thick with genuine emotion, finally using the term of endearment that had been withheld for so long. She danced right there in the ward, her head tie bouncing with joy as she celebrated the expansion of her lineage. The floodgates of her affection opened. She brought lavish gifts, expensive jewelry, and even a brand-new car for Aid to celebrate the arrival of the boys. To the shock of the entire family, Mrs. Cletus did not stop at the newborns. She reached out and scooped up Kelechi Jr., hugging him tightly against her chest. "Come here, my first grandbaby," she whispered, finally acknowledging the boy as her own. For the first time since Aid had entered her life, the older woman smiled at her without a trace of reserve or hidden judgment. The war of the classes had ended not with a shout, but with the soft cries of children and the shared pride of motherhood. As the months passed, the mansion's walls no longer echoed with silence and stifled mutterings, but with laughter, the energetic cries of 3 boys, and the sweet yeasty smell of freshly baked bread from Aid's ever-growing business empire. The woman who had once been slapped on a sweltering market street for leaning on the wrong car was now Madame Aid Cletus, a wife, a mother of 3, a business mogul, and a respected mistress of the mansion. She had traveled a long, dusty road from hawking pure water under a scorching sun to sitting at the head of a table where she was loved and untouchable. As she looked across the dinner table at Kelechi and their children, She knew that the assault on the road had been the painful beginning of a life she had once only dared to dream of, and she knew that this was only the start of their greatest chapter.